She walked into the cafe late that day, soaked from a sudden summer storm. Hair stuck to her cheeks, her canvas bag dripping at the seams. She shook off the rain and stepped inside, expecting nothing, expecting no one. And then he was there, just like that, in the same chair, laptop open, coffee untouched. He looked older somehow, or maybe thinner. His hair was longer at the edges, and he wore a shirt she didn't recognize. But it was him. And he was looking at her. Not startled, not surprised. Just looking as if he had been waiting, not anxiously but patiently, like someone who trusted that the tide would bring her back. Their eyes met, and it was like all the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding rushed out at once. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He simply smiled. The same half-smile she'd seen once before, on a dark morning when the power went out and something between them sparked quietly in the silence. Julia didn't move at first. She stood in the doorway dripping rain and disbelief, staring at a man she had missed more than logic could justify. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. Julia arrived in the seaside town with 2 suitcases, a bruised heart, and the kind of silence that follows a storm no one else saw coming. She had left a promising job, a relationship that had long since dried up, and a city where no one really missed her when she was gone. The move wasn't an escape. It was an erasure. Her new apartment was old and drafty, with windows that rattled in the wind and stairs that creaked under every step. But the sea was nearby, and she liked the way the gulls cried through the fog in the early morning. She kept to herself, setting up routines like scaffolding around her solitude. One of them was the cafe. Small, worn-in with fogged windows and the comforting scent of burnt espresso. The first time she noticed him, it was raining. Not the clean kind of rain that washed away worries, but a cold, relentless drizzle that clung to her coat and seeped under her skin. She had just ducked inside the cafe, shaking the wet from her umbrella, when she saw him at the window table. He looked like someone who had been there for hours. Laptop open, coffee long forgotten, eyes fixed on the screen but not really reading. He wore a dark sweater with the sleeves pushed up, revealing ink stains on his fingers. The kind of man who seemed to carry whole stories in the tired set of his shoulders. She wondered if he was a writer, a professor, someone who had also left a life behind. She made a mental note to never sit too close, not out of shyness but because something about his stillness made her feel like an intruder. But she kept coming back. And so did he. Their unspoken coexistence became something almost ritualistic. Some mornings she would arrive first, and feel a slight disappointment if he didn't follow. Other days, he'd already be there, and she'd feel something warm and inexplicable in her chest. They never spoke, but the awareness between them began to feel almost physical, like a thin, vibrating wire stretched taut across the room. One morning, a moment happened that she would replay for months after. She had been standing in line, scanning the shelves absently when her gaze drifted to the window. He was there as usual, but this time he wasn't looking at his screen. He was watching her reflection. Not her directly, just the mirror image in the glass pane behind her. And when their eyes locked, through that soft layer of glass and fog and distance, it felt like the air caught its breath. It lasted no more than 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds the world narrowed. Her pulse stuttered. And then, like nothing had happened, he looked back at his screen, adjusted his posture, and began typing again. Julia stood in line pretending nothing inside her had shifted. But it had. From that day forward, her mornings were no longer about the coffee. They were about that quiet, electrifying tension. The lingering sense that something was beginning. Not with a bang, not even with a word, but with a glance that saw more than it should have. The cafe became a kind of stage where their lives silently overlapped. 2 strangers orbiting the same space, aware of each other in ways they'd never admit. Over time, Julia began to notice patterns, and once noticed, she couldn't stop. He arrived most mornings just after 8, always carrying a battered brown satchel and a folded umbrella tucked under one arm, rain or shine. His coffee was always black, no sugar. He sat in the same seat, by the foggy window, third table from the back, as though the view out to the harbor somehow anchored him. She wondered if he liked watching the fishing boats ease in, the gulls wheeling overhead, or if he was just afraid of changing something that had once worked. He wrote furiously sometimes, back hunched, hands flying over the keys as though the words were burning a hole in him. Other times, he just stared at the screen, jaw clenched, as if whatever he was writing refused to be pinned down. Julia could feel the weight of his frustration from across the room. It made her strangely protective of him, like she had glimpsed a vulnerability no one else had. She began to sync her arrival with his. Not exactly on purpose, but not accidentally either. She'd walk slowly from her apartment, pausing by the bookstore window or pretending to check her phone, all to catch that exact moment when she'd open the cafe door and find him already seated. On days when he wasn't there yet, she'd feel an unspoken tension coil in her chest, easing only when she heard the bell above the door jingle and saw him step in, damp hair flattened by the sea air, eyes slightly red-rimmed like he hadn't slept much. They never acknowledged each other. Not directly. But their rituals began to echo. He started leaving a book on the edge of his table when he went to the counter, spine turned outward. Julia realized quickly he wasn't reading them, at least not while she was there. Felt like a signal. The titles became more pointed. Collections of essays on solitude, poetry about missed connections. One morning even a travel memoir titled The Places We Leave to Find Ourselves. She'd sit at her table pretending to read her own book, heart pounding as she tried to decipher the meaning behind each choice. Were they random? Or meant for her? Once, she accidentally made eye contact with him as he looked up mid-thought. His gaze tired but warm. He didn't look away immediately this time. Instead, he let the moment stretch just enough to say, "I see you too." Then he smiled faintly, barely, and returned to his work. There was also a moment 2 weeks later, when the power went out mid-morning during a storm. The cafe dimmed, the coffee machines went silent, and everyone groaned except them. Julia looked up instinctively, and he was looking at her. No laptop screen, no distractions, just him and her, and the sudden quiet that made everything feel more naked. They both stayed seated, unmoving, like neither of them wanted to risk breaking something invisible between them. And just like that, their silence became its own language. To anyone else, they were two people who never spoke, never even sat together. But to Julia, and perhaps to him, their connection was louder than words. It built itself slowly, in mirrored glances, half-smiles, shared weather, and invisible threads woven between tables. She knew it was fragile. She knew it could break. But she also knew, deep down, that something about it mattered more than most things she'd clung to before. It wasn't love yet, but it was becoming something that felt like the beginning of love, if either of them ever found the courage to speak. Started on a Monday. The sky was a dull, woolen gray, and the kind of cold that sunk into bones even before you stepped outside. Julia had woken with that quiet sense of anticipation she could never quite explain anymore. Not for her work, not for the town, not for the coffee, but for the flicker of possibility that came with seeing him. Even from across the cafe. Even if nothing was ever said. She arrived just after 8:10 a.m., a few minutes late, just enough to heighten the hope that he'd already be there. But the window table was empty. His seat. His usual corner. Me. She waited. Ordered. Sat with her notebook open but blank, stealing glances at the door every time it opened. Her heartbeat jumped once when a man in a dark coat walked in with the same stride, but when he turned, it wasn't him. Not even close. Still, she told herself maybe tomorrow. But the next day, he wasn't there either. Nor the day after. The absence was like a ringing in her ears she couldn't shake. His missing presence changed the air. The cafe felt colder, noisier. The light too sharp. The tables too far apart. Even the barista's casual smile when she handed over Julia's coffee felt misplaced. Like the script had changed but no one had told her. She sat at her usual table, eyes flicking up every few minutes as if sheer focus could conjure him into being. Instead she noticed other things. His absence made space for memory. She remembered how he always sat with his legs folded under his chair, the way he tugged at his left sleeve when deep in thought, the slow way he'd reach for his coffee without looking. So familiar now it hurt to remember. After 4 days, she began to doubt herself. Had she imagined it all? The glances, the book titles left like breadcrumbs, the near smile when the lights went out. Had she built something out of nothing? Then came the 5th day. The cafe was half empty, the morning unusually bright after a long spell of rain. Julia came in, tired and on edge, ready to pretend indifference. But something was different. It was a note, pinned on the old cork bulletin board near the door. Among missing pet flyers and poetry readings, was a small, folded piece of paper, crisp white, neatly typed, held in place by a faded train ticket. At first, she wasn't sure what drew her to it. There was nothing flashy about it. But the ticket caught her eye. She stepped closer. There, in plain text, were the words.
Gone for a while. To finish something I started long ago. If you've ever wondered, yes, I noticed you too.
She froze. The air seemed to thin around her. The words on the page blurred slightly, not because of the font, but because her eyes stung suddenly and unexpectedly. Her throat tightened. It was his. Had to be. She read it again. Then once more. There was no name, no date, no promise. But it was enough to change everything. He hadn't disappeared into disinterest. He had noticed. All of it. Her presence, their rituals, the magnetic thread they never pulled taut. He had known she was there, just as she had known he was watching too. He had left something unfinished, and now so had she. Julia stood there for a long time, people coming and going behind her like static. She didn't take the note down. She didn't even touch it. Instead, she sat at her table, looked at the empty chair by the window, and finally understood what it meant to miss someone she had never truly met. And in the quiet that followed, she realized something else. He hadn't said goodbye. Lee.
Gone for a while.
And that was everything. Time passed as it always does. Not with drama or ceremony, but with slow, indifferent certainty. Julia stayed. There had been no decision, really. Just a day she didn't pack, and another she paid rent. And a morning she woke up and realized the town no longer felt like a layover but something closer to home. The mornings were still cold. The sea still smelled the same. But without him, the rhythm of her days changed, like a song missing its low, steady drum. She still visited the cafe, still ordered her tea, still sat by the window, but there was no magnetic field anymore. No quiet hum of another presence occupying the same orbit. The chair by the window remained mostly empty. Once or twice, a tourist sat there with a newspaper or a mother with a fussy toddler, but it always felt wrong, like a stranger sitting in a pew at a private funeral. Julia never took the seat herself. It wasn't hers. It never had been. But it belonged to something. To someone. And in her mind, he would return to it one day. Just as suddenly as he'd vanished. She didn't try to find him. Something about the note made it feel sacred. Intended only for those who could read between the lines. It wasn't an invitation to chase. It was a whisper of possibility. So instead she began again. She found freelance work with a local paper. She took walks along the cliffs at dusk, started planting herbs on her balcony, began to sleep without dreams. She even joined a book club, though she never quite mentioned the man she thought about every time someone asked about her favorite story. But his absence never fully left her. It clung to the edges of her life like mist on a mirror, easy to wipe away for a moment, but always returning. Once, in late spring, she found a book tucked into the free library box on the pier, a volume of poetry by an obscure traveler poet. Inside the front cover was a note scrawled in ink. There are cities that remember us even when we forget ourselves. She stared at the handwriting for a long time, willing it to be familiar. Was it his sign? Coincidence? She left the book there, but she returned the next morning to find it gone. Summer bloomed slowly that year. Warm rains, overgrown grass, light that stretched long into the evenings. Julia had begun to accept that some connections aren't meant to be resolved, that some people appear in our lives like constellations, distant, unreachable, but shaping the way we navigate the darkness. Until one ordinary Tuesday in late July, everything changed. She walked into the cafe late that day, soaked from a sudden summer storm. Hair stuck to her cheeks, her canvas bag dripping at the seams. She shook off the rain and stepped inside, expecting nothing, expecting no one. And then he was there, just like that, in the same chair, laptop open, coffee untouched. He looked older somehow, or maybe thinner. His hair was longer at the edges, and he wore a shirt she didn't recognize. But it was him. And he was looking at her. Not startled, not surprised. Just looking as if he had been waiting, not anxiously but patiently, like someone who trusted that the tide would bring her back. Their eyes met, and it was like all the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding rushed out at once. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He simply smiled. The same half-smile she'd seen once before, on a dark morning when the power went out and something between them sparked quietly in the silence. Julia didn't move at first. She stood in the doorway dripping rain and disbelief, staring at a man she had missed more than logic could justify. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. No words passed between them. None were needed. In that moment, everything they had not said became real. He was back. And so was the rhythm. There was no need for a grand reconciliation. No dramatic speech. No catching up over wine and flickering candles. No sudden confessions. Just time. And the quiet understanding that sometimes, the most profound connections don't arrive with declarations, but with recognition. After that first afternoon when he reappeared, they didn't speak right away. He nodded gently when she took the seat across from him, and they sat in a comfortable, charged silence as the rain continued to fall against the windows. His laptop was open but he didn't type. Her tea went cold in her hands. Nothing was urgent. Nothing needed fixing. It was enough to share space again. The days that followed unfolded not in explosive moments, but in quiet increments. He returned to his routine. So did she. But the silence between them changed. It softened. Now, when they arrived at the cafe, they sat at the same table, side by side, no longer tethered to opposite corners of the room. One morning, she arrived to find a book waiting at her usual seat. It was a copy of Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. Inside, a train ticket was tucked like a bookmark, the same kind that had pinned his note to the wall months earlier. She opened to the marked page and read, "Love consists in this, that two solitudes protect and touch and greet each other." It undid her more than any spoken word could have. Slowly, their lives began to intertwine. She learned his name at last, Adrian. That he had left to finish a novel he'd been writing for 7 years. A book he once thought he'd never complete because he'd lost faith in endings. He had gone to Paris, then Lisbon, then a small town in Croatia where he wrote in an old fishing shack and thought about her more than he wanted to admit. He told her these things not all at once, but in pieces, like a puzzle he had carefully guarded. And in turn, Julia revealed parts of herself too. How she had felt forgotten in her last life, how this town had been her retreat and her test. How she used to come to the cafe not for the coffee, but for the weight of someone who didn't look away. They never labeled what grew between them. They just let it happen. Afternoons turned to evenings. Her books migrated to his apartment. His favorite mug ended up on her shelf. On Sundays, they stayed in bed past 10, listening to the gulls and sharing the crossword in long, contented silences. When they walked, they didn't always hold hands, but their shoulders brushed, and that was enough. There was a day in late autumn, nearly a year after they'd first locked eyes in that fogged-up cafe window, when Julia realized the loneliness she once wore like armor had simply fallen away. They were walking back from the market. She carried a bundle of fresh thyme and a baguette tucked under one arm. He was telling her about a passage he was revising, something about truth and restraint. And she realized, as the sun cut through the clouds in slanted gold, that she no longer checked the door when she entered rooms. She didn't scan for exits. She didn't wonder if she was being seen. She knew she was chosen. Not for her brightness or her effort, or the way she filled a silence, but for the quiet way she had been herself without trying. She looked at him then, this man who had once been a stranger with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers, and understood. It had always been him. Even when they hadn't known each other's names. Even when they'd only existed in glances and unspoken rituals. Even in the space between their hellos and not quite goodbyes. Only him. Only her. Only this. Only you.